So contrary to popular belief, Russian troops just received a batch of 200 brand new T-90 tanks. That's more combat-ready tanks than the German army has available. Yuri takes a shot of vodka, goes to the factory, and builds you 200 tanks before lunch. Yuri's pronouns are build tanks. Yuri, the moment he enters the tank factory, he's like, I love the smell of fresh tanks in the morning. With that being said, the mainstream media is slowly preparing us for the fall of Bahmut. Here, the Daily Telegraph. Inside Bahmut, the strange and senseless death trap, draining Ukraine's tired army. Here's another article from The Economist titled, Russia is hurling troops at the tiny Ukrainian town of Bahmut. But the battle is bloody and pointless. And what's crazy is that they write in the article that if Russia were to conquer it, it would not have the manpower to breach further lines of defense to the west. My friends, the writing is on the wall. And if you were not convinced, here's the Financial Times. Hell, just hell. Ukrainian Russia's war of attrition over Bahmut. But then this article writes pure fiction, the type of fantasy that would make Tolkien blush. They write, I quote, then came the Russian infantry, charging in a First World War style attack across a no man's land of shredded trees and artillery craters. The Ukrainians popped up and mowed down many of them with machine guns. Moments later, the scenes were repeated, although this time the Russian fighters had to navigate their comrades' bodies. Again, many were cut down by Ukrainian bullets. Poor journalism! What next? The Russians positioned machine guns behind their own men and fired at anyone who was retreating. The reality on the ground is completely different. Here's a video from Bahmut filmed by the armed forces of Ukraine. The city is almost under continuous Russian artillery fire. There's simply no places where the shells do not arrive. For once, The Guardian had an interesting article. They interviewed a Ukrainian soldier, and he said that 80% of the population around here are pro-Russian. The ones who weren't have left. It wasn't like when we were fighting in Kherson. Then the civilian population seemed generally happy to see us. Is it me, or all this seems like a huge repeat of the battles of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk? Put simply, the Battle of Bahmut is a huge vortex, and the outcome depends on how much each side is willing to sacrifice. With that being said, the fact that Russia has nearly a 10-to-1 advantage in firepower makes the defense of Bahmut extremely costly, where Ukraine essentially trades men for time. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Remember that if you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. Oh, I almost forgot, if you're interested in military tactics. In my last video, I covered a war that foreshadowed everything we see now in Ukraine. Heavy use of drones, kilometers of trenches, foreign fighters and mercenaries, lots and lots of artillery, both howitzers and MR-less systems, Soviet equipment used on both sides, massive tank formations, and even war gonzo was there. As you probably guessed it, I'm talking about the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And if you want to know how Azerbaijan won the war in only 44 days, a military masterpiece, the link is in the description. With that being said, thank you to everyone that has supported me on Patreon and PayPal. And welcome to the headquarters. In my opinion, the Russian command in front of Bahmut separated its forces into divisions, Group South and Group North. The overall strategy is to pin down Ukrainian forces using overwhelming artillery fire, fix Ukrainian troops in the center, and envelop Bahmut from both the north and the south. This will force the Ukraine command to choose between an encirclement or pulling out. Alright, for this analysis, should we start on top or bottom? Let's go down south. Let's start on bottom. Like I mentioned in my previous Ukraine update, the objective of the Russian troops of Group South is to capture these heights, which we can see using an elevation map. And recently they captured the surrounding area of the village of Kordyumivka. Overall, the Russian tactic is to go from one village to another, and every new captured settlement becomes a pivot point from where they can regroup and launch an attack towards another village. If the Russians control these heights, they can cut off Bahmut, or even more dangerous, move towards Kostiantynivka. There are many benefits to holding the high ground, but in this case it allows Russian artillery observers to have a direct line of sight on all Ukrainian positions near Bahmut. They simply have to use goggles, radio artillery, and that's it. And this is especially important because of winter, with short daylight hours and bad weather, which limits the capabilities in observation and reconnaissance using UAVs. Now, according to the latest news, Russian troops have crossed the canal linking the Seversky Donetsk River to Donbass. And according to reports of the Ukrainian General Staff, Russian forces probed Ukrainian defenses as far as Bilaura. But nothing to worry about because that Russian attack was halted. No, but seriously, do you realize how deep they went? There are also mentions of Russian attacks in the area of Shumy. Pretty surprising to me. Personally, I don't think these will lead anywhere because the area of Toretsk and everything around it is heavily fortified. But who knows? However, as of now, the main Russian push is directed towards the village of Klishivka. Ukrainian forces still hold the area, but it will be difficult, since the direct road between Bahmut and Klishivka is now under fire control of the Russian army. That means that they have a direct line of sight and they can bombard it whenever they want. So Ukrainians launched this Skala drone and published footage of the fighting taking place around Bahmut. And of course, some people on Twitter immediately geolocated these positions. Let's say that the situation is much worse than we all thought. So on the map, here's Klishivka and here's Opitne. It's a southern suburb of Bahmut. And if it falls, it allows Russian armed forces to go straight into the heart of the city. Now, as you can see, the Russians are pushing west of Opitne, thus in the process of cutting off Klishivka from Bahmut. The Ukrainian defenders will have a hard time being resupplied and rotated out with fresh reserves. Further north, the Russians captured some garbage dump in an attempt to cut off Opitne from Bahmut. All these Russian flanking maneuvers mean that this area will be very difficult to hold for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Suryak Maps claims that actually half of Opitne is under Russian control. Now Ukraine sent column after column to counterattack and try to regain the lost positions. However, Russia has more and more drones in the sky that can spot any armored column from miles away. And as you know, the moment they're spotted, they can be targeted with artillery fire. That means that these guys can suffer heavy losses without even seeing an enemy. And this comes as Ukraine reports mention an increasing shortage of armored vehicles in the Ukrainian army due to battle attrition. Now this is problematic because it considerably reduces the mobility of Ukrainian forces. Some go as far as to say that Ukraine loses in a week what it receives from Europe in a month. Here near Bakhmut, you can see a destroyed Ukrainian Brem 1 and a YPR 675 armored personnel carrier. Here's another one of these Dutch armored personnel carriers, captured during the storming of Kordyomivka. And because of this increasing lack of vehicles, these soldiers claim that they had to walk to their new position located 7 kilometers away. According to that same Ukrainian Skala drone footage, some Russian assault groups managed to push towards the factories east of Bakhmut. After getting hold of the factories, they gained momentum and have now entered the residential sectors east of Bakhmut. And according to the map of my friend Defense Politics Asia, Russians are also probing Ukraine defenses near Pidhorodne. And now this is where things get very interesting. All these Russian gains are sort of confirmed by this footage from foreign fighters from the International Legion, who claim to be fighting somewhere northeast of Bahmut. Now we see in this video that they're fighting in some sort of forest. Now using this map, if we look for wooden areas, we can guess that the firefight most likely took place in one of these woods. And now according to the Wagner PMC's map, their guys infiltrated these woods right here. So if we put everything back into perspective, I'm almost certain that the firefight of these foreign fighters most likely took place in these woods, right there. And here's footage from a Ukrainian sniper, which indirectly shows how battles are now directly on the outskirts of Bahmut. One thing is certain, if Pidhorodne falls, it's the entire line of supply north of Bahmut that collapses. So Ukrainians have to hold this position no matter the cost. And not surprisingly, there are a lot of reports of heavy tank battles in the area of Pidhorodne, but also Opitne and Kordyomivka. Reports mention how Ukrainian tanks suffer from overuse. Meanwhile, interruptions in electricity and a lack of spare parts prevent them from quick repairs. Cold weather also forces Ukrainians to keep vehicles with running engines, which makes them a target for sabotage groups of the Russian armed forces, armed with Kornet anti-tank systems and Irony surveillance devices that detect enemy equipment in the dark at a distance of 7 kilometers. but it seems that the Ukrainians are really worried of a Russian breakthrough north of the city. So they decided to preemptively blow up one of the most important bridges north of Bahmut to avoid any quick Russian breakthrough. To me, this could be some sort of foreshadowing, some sort of sign that Ukrainians are already in the process of withdrawing. It could be that for now their goal is to hold Bakhmut as long as possible, while they're building a second line of defense for the west, thus confirming the theory that they're trading men for time. And most importantly, the second line of defense would be centered on Chasiv Yar, now further away from Bahmut. The Russian PMC Wagner is also tasked with breaking through this ridge, these line of heights, in an attempt to bypass Solidar from the north. A couple of days ago, units of Wagner mercenaries drove Ukrainian troops out of the village of Yakovlivka. But there was something very strange. Most maps agree that Yakovlivka is now firmly under Russian control, just like Bilahorivka and Spirne. Yet official statements of the Ukrainian armed forces claim that units of the defense forces repulsed attacks by the Russian occupiers in the areas of the settlements of Yakovlivka. I don't know, I'll let you decide. It's also important to note that in this sector, Russians benefit from significant air support. We got a lot of footage of Russian attack helicopters like the Ka-52 and the Mi-28, launching unguided aircraft missiles at an angle of 30 to 45 degrees. It is said that this tactic allows the helicopters to cover targets over a large area, while remaining out of reach of enemy anti-aircraft installations. Is it a sign that possibly Ukraine is starting to be low on anti-air defense? Anyway, from the pivot point of Yakovlivka, I believe that the Russians will converge towards Vesely. It's a very small village. If we zoom in, you can basically see it's some sort of big building, some farm, and a couple residential buildings. Its small size also means that it will be easier for Russian forces to penetrate into the village. That also means that it will be hard to defend. So watch out for any news regarding the village of Vesely, because from there the Russian maneuver could be some sort of hook towards Razdolivka, Mykolaivka, Krasnopolivka. The goal of this maneuver might be to reach the area right in between Siversk and Bahmut, and bypass the impregnable fortress of Solidar, and simply cut off its supplies from the rear. At this point of the video, you probably notice how on a tactical level, the Russians always do the same thing: bypass, chunk up, and isolate enemy positions, and always force them to choose between withdrawal or encirclement. This is textbook from what they did in Syria. It's a slow process, very predictable, but it saves lives, especially since they benefit from overwhelming firepower. What to expect from Bahmut? It's like visiting Canada, it's better to have low expectations. Here you can see the area for which the Wagner PMC and Ukrainian forces have been fighting for months. To me it looks apocalyptic. The soldiers on both sides are suffering from the drop in temperature and lack of supplies. The front is simply so big that it's hard for the command to keep track of every single unit. Apparently in this video, some Ukrainian soldiers complained that they haven't seen their commanding officer for weeks. He says that they're positioned in the second line of defense, but because of artillery, they lost 8 out of 20 people in 3 weeks. It's very possible that they get spotted because they use fires, but they say that they don't care. Their primary worry is to keep warm and eat hot food. But there's definitely some hope, like the appearance of 28 Slovenian M55S tanks in Ukraine. The M55S is a deep upgrade of the Soviet T-55 tank, with a new 105mm L7 gun, air defense system with night vision sight, ballistic computer, laser rangefinder, and explosive reactive armor protection. I'm not the greatest tank expert, so let me know if these Slovenian tanks actually stand a chance against the newer T-90 and T-72s. Regarding Casualty, Swiss TV interviewed a Ukrainian doctor in Bahmut. He says that 90% of wounds were caused by mine fragments, aka artillery fire, while wounds from direct confrontation and firearms were much lower. And in this TikTok video, another Ukrainian soldier says they suffered heavy losses in Bahmut. He estimates 500 to 1,200 per day. 200 is code for KIA. 300 means wounded. So he claims between 500 to 1,000 KIA per day. I think he's exaggerating. Or rather, I hope so. But let's say he talks about KIA and wounded, and we take an average of 750. That means 22,500 casualties. 2 divisions! Now if this seems excessive, Newsweek published an interesting article where they interviewed Colonel Melbourne from the Mozart PMC. He said that Ukrainian troops have been taking extraordinarily high casualties. The numbers you're reading in the media about 70% and above casualties being routine are not exaggerated. Hold on, what did he say? No, Milburn is probably a Russian agent. Colonel Milburn continues that despite their tremendous morale, the defenders have an acute regeneration problem, which means getting new recruits into the line as quickly as possible. This means those being thrown into the fight have little beyond basic training. He explains how typically above 80% of their replacements on the front have never even fired a weapon before. That's it! Milburn is paid by the Kremlin! He ends the interview by admitting, "I'm terrified we're going to run out of steam early in the new year," noting that sourcing, repairing, and replacing damaged vehicles is the biggest expense. And this confirms earlier reports of the lack of vehicles in the Ukrainian army. He's one of Putin's propagandists! And since we're talking about the training and replacements, Russian military bloggers mentioned Ukrainian soldiers that were captured mid-November near Bahmut, belonging to the 71st, 58th, and 53rd Brigades of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Allegedly, many of these captured soldiers went through training in the UK or were trained by American, Canadian, and Australian instructors in Ukraine. They complained that the training they received was insufficient, essentially 20 days of counterinsurgency tactics built on small mobile groups, not designed for intense battles where the enemy has a firepower advantage. I'm just reporting to you what they said. Is it true, or is it a quick job at NATO? Let me know what you think in the comment section. The article from Newsweek also mentions how Ukraine closely guards its casualty figures, but as you can see, its forces are believed to have suffered badly near Bahmut. According to my estimates, since the beginning of the war, Ukraine lost at least 100,000 soldiers KIA, plus X amount of missing, while Russia lost roughly 15,000 KIA. I think the explanation of these results deserves a self-standing video. So let me know in the comment section if this is something you would be interested in. That's all I have for you today. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you like this report, make sure to support my work on Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description.